The aroma of slow-roasted pot roast filled my cozy kitchen in suburban Columbus, Ohio. At 64, after working 32 years as a high school librarian, I cherished my peaceful weekends. I adjusted my reading glasses and smoothed my floral apron as my son Julian walked in with his wife Bridget. Bridget dropped her designer purse onto my pristine granite counter with a heavy thud. She didn't offer a greeting, nor did she help carry the serving dishes to the dining table. During dinner, the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Julian kept staring at his plate, pushing his carrots around with a fork. Bridget cleared her throat loudly, cutting through the silence. She explained that they found a spacious 4-bedroom house in a gated community nearby. The down payment was $80,000, a sum they couldn't afford on their current salaries. Bridget leaned forward, resting her elbows on my handmade tablecloth. She demanded that I transfer my life savings to her personal bank account by Friday so they could put down an offer. I stared at her in utter disbelief. My savings consisted of money I had meticulously accumulated over decades of hard work and careful budgeting. When I gently explained that those funds were my safety net for healthcare and living expenses, Bridget let out a loud, mocking laugh. "You're retired. What do you even need that money for?" Bridget laughed. I looked her straight in the eye and replied with complete calm, "Myself." Bridget gasped at my answer, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She clearly expected me to hand over my hard-earned nest egg without a single question. Julian remained completely silent, staring down at his napkin and refusing to meet my gaze. I picked up my fork and calmly continued eating my dinner. That night, I quietly updated my online bank passwords and placed all my financial documents inside a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. The next afternoon, I sat on my front porch, sipping black tea. The cold autumn wind rustled the golden leaves on the oak tree in my front yard. My phone rang, displaying Julian's caller ID. When I answered, Bridget was on the line instead. She skipped any polite greeting and immediately brought up the money again. She argued that keeping my savings in a money market account was wasteful when it could help them secure a family home. Her tone implied that my financial independence was an inconvenience to their lifestyle goals. I listened quietly while trimming the dead leaves off my potted chrysanthemums. This behavior was not a sudden misunderstanding. Last winter, Bridget pressured me to sell my late husband's restored vintage pickup truck below market value to her younger brother. 2 years ago, she insisted I pay for their elaborate anniversary trip to Florida, claiming retirees had no real expenses. Each time, she treated my personal assets as shared family property waiting to be claimed. Julian always stood in the background, minimizing her entitlement as mere enthusiasm. He never asked her to tone down her aggressive requests or apologize for her rude remarks. I reminded Bridget that my retirement funds were allocated for long-term health insurance, home repairs, and personal care as I aged. She snapped that I was being overly dramatic about the future and hoarding wealth I didn't need. She asserted that young couples deserved financial boosts more than senior citizens who stayed at home all day. I firmly told her that my financial decisions were final and non-negotiable. Before she could start another demanding rant, I politely bade her goodbye and ended the call. I walked inside my quiet hallway and pulled out my monthly ledger. I began reviewing every single recurring subscription and joint account setting. I decided right then to remove Julian's name from my secondary checking account, ensuring complete independence over my hard-earned assets moving forward. On Wednesday morning, I drove my sedan to the local bank branch downtown. The teller greeted me warmly as I filled out the necessary paperwork to revoke Julian's authorized user access to my emergency checking account. I also set up 2-factor authentication on all my retirement portfolios, routing every security alert directly to my personal mobile phone. For years, I had maintained that shared account to easily send Julian birthday gifts or cover minor home repair expenses for them. However, Bridget's recent demands proved that financial proximity only invited unwanted entitlement. Later that afternoon, Julian dropped by my house under the pretense of borrowing my lawnmower. As he rolled the equipment out of the garage, he mentioned that Bridget was upset about the bank notification she saw on his phone. He scratched the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable as he asked why I suddenly changed the account settings. I handed him a fresh glass of lemonade and explained that I was reorganizing my estate planning to ensure all my records were current. Julian brushed off my explanation, waving his hand dismissively. He insisted Bridget was just stressed about their apartment lease expiring in 3 months. He claimed she didn't mean any harm by her blunt comments during Sunday's dinner. I smiled gently, but offered no apology or concession. I reminded him that borrowing equipment was always fine, but my bank accounts were strictly off-limits. He stood in the driveway for a moment, shifting his weight nervously before loading the mower into his trunk. That evening, I declined my usual invitation to host their weekend dinner. Instead, I signed up for a weekly night class on digital archiving at the community center. I filled my calendar with activities that centered around my own personal growth and well-being. I was no longer available at their beck and call. The local library hosted a community book sale on Saturday morning. I volunteered at the checkout desk, scanning paperbacks and chatting with longtime neighbors. Around noon, I ran into Martha, a close friend whose daughter worked at the same mortgage brokerage Bridget visited the previous week. Martha innocently mentioned that Bridget and Julian had already submitted a pre-approval application for the 4-bedroom house, falsely listing my savings account balance as part of their liquid assets. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression composed. Bridget had not just asked for the money, she had actively presumed my compliance on official financial documents. She had taken my silence during previous family favors as a guarantee that I would fund her extravagant lifestyle. I thanked Martha for the casual chat, neatly packed my canvas tote bag, and walked out to my car. The autumnal air felt crisp, sharpening my focus as I sat in the driver's seat. Instead of driving straight home to Brood, I drove to the county registrar's office and picked up a fresh set of property tax forms. I verified that my home title was entirely in my name, with no remaining liens or secondary names attached. While sitting in the parking lot, I received a text from Bridget asking if I wanted to join them for lunch at an expensive bistro downtown. She added a note saying we could finalize the money transfer details over dessert. I typed a concise reply stating I was busy with community work and would not be attending lunch. I added that any financial figures involving my retirement funds must be removed from their mortgage applications immediately. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed repeatedly with frantic text messages from Bridget, but I turned the device on silent. I spent the remainder of the afternoon strolling through the botanical gardens, admiring the vibrant fall foliage in peaceful solitude. Rain taped steadily against my living room windows on Monday afternoon. Julian came over alone, shaking water from his umbrella as he stepped into the entryway. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a worried slant to his posture. He sat at the kitchen table and finally spoke openly about their situation. He admitted that Bridget had pushed them to apply for a mortgage far beyond their realistic budget, convincing him that I would naturally bridge the financial gap. I made us a pot of herbal tea and sat across from him. Julian confessed that Bridget felt entitled to my money because I lived simply and rarely traveled. In her mind, an older widow living in a paid-off home had no practical use for substantial liquid savings. Julian admitted he felt trapped between his wife's grand ambitions and his knowledge of my boundaries. He asked if I could at least co-sign the mortgage loan to lower their interest rate. I looked at my son, feeling a quiet pang of sadness for his lack of resolve, but my decision remained unshakable. I reminded him that co-signing a loan meant taking on full legal liability for a debt I did not incur. I told him that real maturity meant living within one's actual means, not relying on a parent's safety net to fund luxury. "I love you, Julian," I said clearly, "but I will not put my financial security at risk for a house you cannot afford. You need to handle your own finances." Julian slumped in his chair, realizing that emotional guilt would not alter my position. He nodded slowly, accepting the reality of my refusal for the first time. He finished his tea in quiet reflection before leaving. After he departed, I called my financial advisor and scheduled an in-person meeting for Thursday morning to solidify my retirement estate boundaries once and for all. Thursday morning arrived with bright sunshine. I met with my financial planner, Arthur, in his downtown office. We spent 2 hours reviewing my retirement portfolio, healthcare proxies, and property deeds. I officially placed all my liquid savings into an irrevocable trust designed to cover my future assisted living and medical costs. The trust explicitly stated that funds could only be dispersed for my direct care, effectively insulating my life savings from any third-party claims or family pressure. Arthur commended my foresight, noting that many retirees drain their assets prematurely due to familial guilt. After leaving his office, I stopped at a local hardware store and bought a high-grade smart deadbolt for my front door. I drove home and spent the afternoon installing the new lock myself, using tools my husband had neatly organized in the garage years ago. I reprogrammed the entry codes, ensuring only I possessed access to my home. Later that evening, I invited my neighbor Clara over for dinner. We cooked a warm vegetable stew and discussed our upcoming trip to a regional gardening convention in Chicago. For years, I had put off personal travel to stay available for Julian's weekend chores and Bridget's last-minute errands. Now, I was booking hotel rooms and planning itineraries that excited me. Around 8 o'clock, Bridget tried using her spare key to enter through the front door to drop off some dry cleaning she wanted me to press. The key failed to turn in the new mechanism. She knocked loudly, her face showing annoyance through the glass panel. I opened the door slightly, holding the frame firmly. I politely informed her that I no longer kept spare keys outside and that I was busy entertaining a guest. Bridget stood frozen on the porch, her arms crossed, realizing her physical access to my private space had been completely revoked. On Sunday evening, Julian and Bridget invited me to their apartment for what they called a reconciliation dinner. I accepted, wanting to maintain a polite family connection while holding my ground. When I arrived, the dining table was set with fancy china, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken strategy. Halfway through the meal, Bridget placed an official-looking document on the table next to my plate. It was a formal private loan agreement she had drafted online. The document outlined a plan where I would lend them $70,000 at a 0% interest rate with repayments starting in 5 years. Bridget smiled brightly, claiming this was a reasonable compromise that respected my ownership of the money. She argued that since I wasn't spending the cash, immediately letting it sit in a low-yield account was financially foolish. She pushed a pen into my hand, urging me to sign the paper before dessert was served. Julian looked down at his plate, remaining completely silent as his wife pressed the issue. I placed the pen neatly beside the document and pushed the paper back across the table. I explained calmly that my money was no longer accessible in a standard liquid account, as it had been officially transferred into a managed trust for my long-term medical care. Bridget's face flushed with anger. She accused me of being cold-hearted and intentionally ruining their dream of homeownership. She claimed I was prioritizing my old age over my son's future happiness. I stood up smoothly, adjusted my jacket, and picked up my handbag. "My retirement savings are for my care, Bridget," I said steadily. "I will not justify how I protect my future." I walked out of their apartment, leaving the loan document sitting untouched on the table. The night air was chilly, but I felt an immense sense of clarity as I drove myself back home. On Tuesday afternoon, Julian showed up at my house unannounced during his lunch break. He walked into the kitchen looking agitated and flustered. He revealed that the mortgage broker had officially rejected their home loan application because they lacked the necessary down payment. Bridget had blamed him for the failure, accusing him of failing to stand up to his mother. Julian was caught in the middle of a conflict he had allowed to fester for months. He asked why I had moved my funds into a trust without consulting him first. He argued that as my only child, he should have been informed about major financial decisions. I sat him down at the counter and pulled out my original budget ledger from 30 years ago. I showed him the precise calculations of what it cost to raise a family, pay off a mortgage, and build a retirement fund from scratch on a librarian's salary. I earned every dollar through decades of discipline. I told him gently but firmly, I did not build this security so someone else could spend it on a luxury house they haven't earned. Julian stared at the yellowed ledger pages, noting the decades of careful planning. For the first time, he saw the reality of my hard work rather than just an abstract pile of available money. I reminded him that enabling Bridget's unreasonable expectations was damaging his own financial future. I told him he needed to take responsibility for his household instead of relying on my life savings. He slumped back in his chair, rubbing his forehead as the truth finally sank in. He admitted that Bridget had been pressuring him to demand the money for over 6 months. He acknowledged that he had been weak in failing to set boundaries with his wife. I handed him a warm cup of coffee, letting the lesson take root without adding unnecessary criticism. The following weekend, I hosted an autumn porch gathering for my local book club. Freshly baked apple cider donuts and hot tea lined the outdoor table. Midway through the afternoon, a luxury sedan pulled up to the curb. Bridget stepped out, looking determined as she marched up the driveway toward my guests. She clearly intended to create a public scene, hoping peer pressure from my neighbors would force me to give in to her demands. She walked right up to the porch, holding a folder containing printed listings of houses they had lost due to lack of funds. In front of 6 of my closest friends, Bridget announced loudly that I was refusing to help my own son buy a home while sitting on a massive fortune. She claimed I was being selfish and abandoning my family in their time of need. The porch fell completely silent as my friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. I stood up slowly, keeping my posture upright and my tone composed. I looked Bridget straight in the eye, maintaining complete control of the situation. Bridget, my retirement savings are secured in a trust for my personal health care and future living expenses. I said loudly enough for everyone to hear clearly. I built that fund myself. As I told you before, if you want a new house, save your own money. The members of my book club nodded in quiet agreement, murmuring supportive words toward me. Bridget looked around the porch, realizing that nobody viewed her as a victim. Her grand public maneuver had completely backfired, exposing her entitlement rather than shaming me. Her cheeks burned bright red with embarrassment. Without another word, she turned on her heel, slammed her folder shut, and hurried back to her car. She drove away rapidly, leaving a cloud of exhaust behind. I calmly sat back down, poured myself another cup of warm cider, and resumed our book discussion as if nothing had happened. 3 months passed, bringing a blanket of fresh snow over Columbus. The boundaries I established created a permanent and healthy shift in our family dynamics. Julian and Bridget ended up renewing the lease on their current apartment for another 2 years. Deprived of my savings as an easy shortcut, they finally began working with a certified financial planner to create an actual savings strategy of their own. Bridget stopped making demands, keeping her distance during family gatherings, and treating me with hesitant respect. Julian visited me every Sunday afternoon, no longer to ask for financial favors, but to catch up over coffee and assist with winter yard maintenance. He took full ownership of his personal life, learning to manage his household budget without expecting handouts. Our conversations became far more genuine, built on mutual respect rather than underlying financial tension. He stopped acting as a proxy for his wife's ambitions and began developing his own financial independence. My life flourished with newfound freedom and activity. I completed my digital archiving course and began volunteering 3 days a week at the Historical Society downtown. My trip to Chicago with Clara was a resounding success, inspiring us to plan a spring tour of gardens across New England. The irrevocable trust remained securely in place, guaranteeing that my future healthcare needs were fully protected regardless of life's uncertainties. Sitting in my comfortable living room beside a crackling fireplace, I felt a deep sense of peace. My home was quiet, secure, and entirely my own. I had protected the fruits of my lifelong labor while teaching my family a vital lesson about self-reliance. I took a slow sip of hot tea, settled into my favorite armchair, and opened a fresh novel. My retirement belonged entirely to me, exactly as I had intended it to be.